You want my opinion? Halloween needed to abandon Michael Myers long ago, and I've never been more serious. To hell with Laurie. To hell with Corey. If anything was made clear to me from this movie, it's that being a fan of this series is a punishment sent to us by the gods. I have never felt more ashamed and hurt to be a fan of Halloween. I've got this all wrong. Let me start at the beginning.
Robert. Kate. Michael Custer.
Christian.
More carbs, and then we're supposed to expect that he can...
Christian. You're doing it again. You were...
Spiraling? Yeah, I know.
That's unproductive because...
Because I keep getting angry.
No, not at all. Anger isn't inherently an evil thing. Spiraling time after time is unproductive because of your attitude. How do you expect to move forward if you won't let yourself? You've been coming to me week after week since the incident in October 2022. And frankly, I see no progress. In fact, I'm convinced you don't want to progress at all. And I've tried to help, but I don't think I can help you. I'm referring you to a new therapist. I want you to walk into your new appointment with a different attitude. I've been very patient with you, but you need to work on the source of all your anger. Otherwise it'll be all that you know. Maybe you can write another one of your essays. You said it yourself here countless times that your creative expression is your healthiest outlet.
I apologize. I didn't mean for it to get this bad.
It's time to help yourself. Oh, and bring your journal to your next appointment. There's lots of important notes in there. I hope you choose to help yourself.
I had spent months trying and failing to suppress my excitement for the final installment in a long line of films, Halloween Ends. The trailers for this movie had sold me right from the beginning. It felt like a return to form fitting for a grand finale. I was ready to wash the sour taste of Halloween Kills out of my mouth because it really hurt me.
Which for me, somehow, after watching the other 11 Halloween movies, Halloween Kills somehow beats all of them in being the most shit.
With that being said, all that Halloween Ends needed to do was not limbo under the bar that was already on the floor. Something that I thought impossible. So, October 14th rolls around and I'm ready. I knew the trailers were hiding something. We had barely seen anything at all. So I knew that whatever was waiting for me was going to be a treat. I got butterflies in my stomach knowing that I was about to see my boy Michael Myers on the big screen, maybe for the last time. But above all else, this overwhelming anticipation to see the closing chapter in a story that I cared so much about. But what I didn't know was that the trick was on me. And so, grinning ear to ear like the naive idiot that I am, it was finally time. And I'll tell you what, 2 hours later, I was not the same person that I was when I entered. Betrayal is such a hard feeling to articulate, and I'm gonna leave you with that, because just about all that I could comprehend was my own insanity. How had they stumbled at the finish line so spectacularly? They had everything there, and all they had to do was follow through. They mischaracterized everyone and systematically dismantled the legacy these movies created. That's it. I simply cannot accept this as the end. Hi, I'm Christian. I have a love-hate relationship with Halloween Ends, and it's ruining my life. For a long time now, I have been carrying around this hatred for a film that did nothing but punish me for loving what came before. It has followed me like my own boogeyman, and I've been told that it's not healthy to hold on to all that. So, here I am, finally talking about Halloween Ends. In a word, I think that this movie is interesting. And if I had to give it a rating, it would lie at about a half star out of 5. To paraphrase myself, along the line of assorted Halloween sequels, Michael has been a little lost in translation. But the through line for this character in every single entry is that he has remained this unkillable, inexplicable machine of terror. Michael Myers is a character who I don't want to understand. He's a character that I want to dread. On October 10th, 2022, those were my closing thoughts in an hour-long love letter to Halloween. Now, from the outset, this may seem dramatic, but the 2022 David Gordon Green directed finale to the recent Halloween trilogy of sequels, Halloween Ends, I think entirely misrepresents the horror genre's oldest and most beloved slasher villain. Let's do a recap. Coming off the cliffhanger of Halloween Kills, Halloween Ends begins 4 years later. Actually, sorry, we pick up 1 year later, where in a brilliant prologue, we're seeing the aftermath of the Haddonfield massacre. Michael is missing, and the children are scared. Look, credit where it's due, Michael has a history of just fucking off into the wilderness for extended periods of time all throughout the Halloween lore. So if anything, at least this movie is a stickler for one tradition. Through a series of unfortunate events, a young 21-year-old man named Corey Cunningham accidentally kills the child he's babysitting. Now we flash forward a couple of years, bringing us to 2022. We've effectively ditched the plot of the previous two films that were both set on Halloween night 2018, and instead pick up the story by primarily following Laurie, Allison, and the new character, Corey. And oh no, Corey is wearing coveralls. Across Act 1, we see how the community blames Laurie for provoking Michael, and similarly how they outcast Corey, labeling him as a child killer. Corey is harassed by some seniors at the local high school, and Laurie jumps to his defense.
Would you look at this? I mean, a psycho meets a freak show. Wow, this is a match made in heaven.
Act 1 ends with Allison and Corey falling head over heels for each other before Corey encounters Hobo Myers hiding out in a sewer cave where this happens.
Why so serious?
Act 2 begins by confirming my deepest fears about the story the second I saw Corey return after the prologue. It was at this point that I decided to close the Wattpad tab, but then I realized that this was still the actual movie. The story begins to meander, retreading essentially the same ground over and over again to hit you over the head with the idea that Michael's evil has manifested itself within Corey. Seriously, everyone and their dog says it. It's not subtle. Allison decides that she wants to leave Haddonfield, and we get a genuinely phenomenal scene depicting Michael and Corey tag-teaming an unsuspecting pair of victims. See, this scene in isolation might very nearly convince you that this film is, dare I say, not a full heaping of shit. But fear not, the high wears off immediately when Laurie and Corey have a sluggish, cheesy verbal battle of ideologies. It pisses Corey right off, and we're propelled into Act 3, where Corey overpowers Michael and takes his mask. Allison and Laurie have an exceptionally artificial and soapy argument, where Allison ultimately leaves Haddonfield. It was at this point I decided to close the DeviantArt tab, but then I realized again, this was still the actual movie. Corey provokes the bullies and leads them to a junkyard where he kills them. In the process, Corey's stepfather is shot dead, so he decides to go home and finish the job with his mother because, sure. Laurie lures Corey to her home, where after a brief scuffle, he frames her for his murder. Of course, Allison walks in at that moment and immediately rushes to conclusions because no single person in this entire movie thinks for themselves or behaves rationally. Michael turns up, but Corey pulls a Billy Loomis before Michael orgasms? It was at this point that I decided to close the AO3 tab, but then I realized that this was, for the final time, still the actual movie. Now quickly, before I move on, I did just make very generalized humor about fanfic to an extreme sense, and in doing that I am deliberately omitting the appeal, themes, and content of an entire community of writers. Please note that it is just intended as humor and doesn't actually reflect how I feel about the tasteful passions that people genuinely do put behind these works. Some of them are fantastic. Most of them are fantastic.
I got a motorcycle.
Oh, a motorcycle. Teach me to ride it?
Corey is dead, Michael attacks Laurie, and after an underwhelming battle, he has finally fallen. He's, and I kid you not, tied to the roof of a car and paraded around town before being tossed into a crusher. Allison finally commits to leaving Haddonfield, and Laurie gets her happily ever after. Until the last frame of the film, which has severely damaging implications. But not before cutting to Don't Fear the Reaper. It's like the movie is laughing at you for sticking around that long. That's Halloween Ends. But disappointment is integral to the Halloween viewing experience. Something that is native to this series of movies since its inception is its cyclical nature with agonizing storytelling. Every halfway decent Halloween film is followed by a shitty one set in a hospital. Or at the very least, something so bizarrely stupid that we'd rather forget it.
Love lives today.
But evil dies tonight.
Every time it goes all the way bad, they end the series. But Michael sells, so sooner or later he's back with a new paint job. If you look at the original and then Halloween Ends back to back, which comes with a chiropractic appointment for your whiplash, you'll see very distinctly how different Michael is approached by either film. Firstly, you have the blueprint. This is the guy that endangered people's idea of a quaint, homely suburbia, upending it with terror and violence come Halloween night. Then you get to Halloween Ends, where we see a Michael that has since been so transformed by decades of pop culture notoriety that it is almost a parody of itself. A version of Michael that exists only through his own stigma. And you'd be forgiven for mistaking him for the real thing, but I assure you, these are not the same character. In his video essay, Why the First Michael Myers Works and the Others Don't, the film warrior states that, quote, outside the original, Michael's always treated like a blunt object, end quote. This is to juxtapose his calculated stalking and invasion to the brute force tank that he is by the time we get to Halloween Kills, which for those unfamiliar is the second part of the new trilogy. This is where I think he sort of needs a bit of that evolution to distinguish himself as a contemporary slasher villain. 2018 more or less gave us the most 1978-like version of him as he'd grown older. It was a reminder of why he is one of the best, while showing that, yeah, he's got a few new tricks up his sleeve. He's terrifying in 1978 because of how smart he is, and equally so he's terrifying in Halloween Kills for how the movie further flirts with the ambiguity of his supernatural prowess. And while that works perfectly in the original for how minimal and unspoken it is, it takes center stage in Kills. Now he's seemingly invincible and grows stronger with each kill. That's not something that I love, and I'd argue that the movie's focusing way too close in on something that functions better when the question is only asked and remains unanswered. Change is necessary sometimes, and to its credit, I do believe that the 2010s-2020s Halloween sequel did indeed need that evolution to establish its identity. There are some aspects of Michael that simply needed to be left behind in 1978, and those all work because of the fast movement of the film and how our frightened brain scrambles to process and respond to the danger. I just think that the Carpenters and Daniel Davies' electric guitar riff for Michael ushers in this new age of old terror beautifully, and it demands him to be physically imposing. For instance, While this scene from the original works so well, a contemporary revision would call for something a bit more dramatic. Compare it with what is essentially the same circumstances in Halloween Ends, and you can see that it's night and day. While the original model uses the kill to demonstrate Michael's captivation by the violence, framing them both in a mid-profile shot, the newer version shifts its framing to a wide, behind the action. It's as though the camera itself is aware of his power and fears Michael. This is just one of the many things I will soon talk about in terms of how the sequels approach Michael not as the masked killer from 1978, but the boogeyman as his infamy in the horror culture sphere would grant him. And if anything, this just tells me one very important thing about director David Gordon Green. That though at his core he's a horror nerd and he loves Michael Myers, maybe he loves what he represents just a little bit more. Why I hate Halloween Ends. Now, this is a loaded discussion. So to properly diagnose what went wrong with Halloween Ends, we gotta look back at the first two movies. And I think that this trilogy and its relationship with its masthead villain characterizes the theme of each movie. 2018 is about the serial killer, Michael Myers. Halloween Kills is about the all-powerful transcendent boogeyman. And Halloween Ends is about the many forms of evil in the shape. Each movie attempts to explore these different facets to the character with varying degrees of success. See, I've been a tad dishonest. For all the good that I've said about the 2018 film, there are elements to it that I really don't love. And I think it's important to discuss those, as they are integral to understanding the broader picture of what failed in the finale. The first of which being the cold opening right at the very beginning of the film. While I think it's necessary to establish that presence for Michael right from the beginning, it actually sets something else up entirely.
You feel it, don't you, Michael?
And it's right here. The movie plants the seed that the mask calls to Michael like it's the root of his evil. Why else might he hunt down those journalists to retrieve it if any other mask could substitute? I mean, iconography, probably. Michael's dripped out, alright? And if it ain't broke, he's been rocking it for 40 years, it's a look. This notion is supported much later on when Dr. Sartain wears the mask for himself. Behaviourally, it's as though the mask contains the source of Michael's power, and Dr. Sartain, much like Dr. Loomis, had spent at this point far too long with his patient. The difference being that while the good doctor would rather blow Michael's dome off at every given chance,
I shot him 6 times!
Sartain set evil free in the name of captivation.
Say something.
Therefore, Halloween 2018 more or less attributes the motif of evil to the wearing of Michael's mask. And while I think that this idea undercuts the very force of nature that he is, it's pretty minimal throughout the movie, so I'm willing to overlook it. But we'll revisit this later. Halloween Kills takes it a step further. Michael's legend is not only a great track on the score, but is one of, if not the main theme behind the entire movie. The story has moved past the novelty of Michael's return to Haddonfield and is now knee-deep into the massacre and the danger of the boogeyman. We actually start the movie with a flashback to 1978 depicting Michael's arrest at the end of the night. This frames another one of the movie's themes, and that is Haddonfield's trauma with Michael. We see how the town is split apart in fear and anger and mob violence as a response to the return of the boogeyman now 40 years later. Evil dies tonight. And this is where David Gordon Green takes Michael a step further. What begins as a subtextual implication quickly balloons into characters directly attributing Michael's supernatural immortality to the violence that's ensuing. There's an absolutely awesome scene of Michael emerging from the burning house and tearing through a team of firefighters. It's an evolution of that blunt object Michael from 2018, and I think it works fantastically. It's engaging, it's terrifying, and it's violent. We're treated to not one, but 2 amazing tracks back to back in the form of He Appears and From the Fire. in what could be interpreted as an almost Western standoff. From the Fire's electric guitar commands fear from Michael before kicking off his next reign of carnage. Over the next 90 minutes, or thereabouts, we see plenty more scenes of Michael being both the invincible tank and the calculated killer, with one of my favourite moments being a chilling off-screen kill.
Michael. You've come home.
I guess death doesn't discriminate, hey Little John? Not exactly allyship, but he's learning, alright? He's pushing 60, I think. On top of that, there's a scene pretty early into the film that shows Michael decorating a corpse with kitchen knives before he finds his own trademark weapon. It's done in a really unsettling shot, entirely from the perspective of the victim's wife, who is slowly succumbing to her injuries. This film appropriately sets this precedent that it doesn't matter how many women holding irons turn up to cream Michael, he is an unstoppable force. But again, that novelty is lost the second you have a character notice it. But you know what? I'd argue that a solid half of this film is not just good, it might even be great. There are aspects to the violence and Michael's subsequent characterization here that are so fun that it pretty much outweighs how it departs from the original form of the character. And again, the score, oh my god is it good! The tracks Rampage, Unkillable and Payback are so testosterone-fueled that if you're trans-masked, listening to these are cheaper than your prescription. Had they not stuck the subtle messaging up all in our faces, I'd be a lot more forgiving. Case in point, Halloween 2018. But look, while I'm here giving some praise to this movie, I may as well comment that I adore the reference to Season of the Witch, often an overlooked film in the franchise that I believe with time has aged quite well. A review from Taylor Leverage puts it best. Quote, "This basically becomes a highlight reel thanks to its lack of focus, bouncing around appropriately gratuitous kills, but never finding any solid ground to stand on. Maybe 25% of this movie is flashbacks or revelations in the past, which makes the franchise feels like it's shackled to 50 years of content without the ability to innovate. There's a bit of a limp commentary on fear, hysteria, and the mob mentality that Michael Myers inspires. But that's a bit hollow when you realize that for all the talk about the real monster, there is still a non-metaphorical monster hanging around stabbing people." End quote. I love that quote. I think it's perfect. Halloween Kills is like Gold FM that plays all of your favorite hits from years ago, perpetually stuck in the past. Now that I think about it, the Haddonfield of Kills and Ends feels less contemporary than its 2018 predecessor. It's like the town inexplicably regressed to the 80s. Kills opens with 1978, and then for the rest of the story, including the time jump to Ends, the town remains in 1978. 2018 feels fresher and more distinct than the others because they just feel too familiar. It's like this movie is more concerned about commenting on Michael Myers than just faithfully depicting him. It's like it's trying to outsmart its audience or beat them to the revelation, or worse yet, artificially ground itself as elevated horror.
Now he's turning us into monsters.
But all that commentary would be communicated well enough if we had just seen it, rather than be lectured. At the end of Act 2, there's a really cruel scene depicting a suicide, and don't worry, I'm not going to put it on screen. But the violence of watching it itself is almost played for spectacle. It wildly overshadows the implications of mob justice, which the film will then spend the better part of the next 10 minutes commenting on in drawn-out speeches and forced melancholy direction. It's like, dude, I don't ever want to watch suicide on screen, but the act of it itself speaks louder than any amount of dialogue you force in to supplement its thematic purpose. Just let the scene do the talking. And before I move on, it would be distasteful not to mention Jamie Lee Curtis's comparison between Kills and the 2020 Black Lives Matters movement that this film was developed during. Sure, it could be topical, commenting on mob justice, but wildly inappropriate given the subject matter between the two. But that's all I'm going to say on it. Beside this, where I think this film nosedives hard is where it attempts to have a conversation about what dwells within Michael. It tries to justify Michael's return to Haddonfield as a return to home, and it falls apart the second it attempts to deconstruct itself.
Maybe he wasn't looking out. Maybe he was looking in. At his reflection. At himself.
In an attempt to dive further in on the mystery, Halloween Kills unwittingly walks it back to neuter Michael to his base form, and say goodbye to what remains of three-dimensional Michael, because from this point on, he is 6 feet below. Now we move on to Halloween Ends, where the opening Universal logo exchanges its usual atmospheric drones from the previous two for instead a campier country song. It's this film's way of immediately shifting the tone and telling you to expect something different this time around. The cold opening, for the first time, doesn't actually feature Michael Myers at all. Instead, it's used to establish how the town-wide fear of the Boogeyman has infected all. See, this time around, the main theme throughout this film is an expansion upon, or what should be a natural conclusion to the mania Michael inspired. What this film ultimately seeks to explore is a step away from Michael himself into what he represents, and how that evil changes shape. The opening titles even support this, depicting their own little story. And oh no, the font is from Season of the Witch. This is a warning. The familiar pumpkins tear through each other, representing the evolution of Michael through over 40 years of storytelling, to where it finally reaches the virgin, uncarved pumpkin which splits open to depict Corey relieving Michael of the role of the Boogeyman. And virgin is an apt term, because for the better part of the rest of this film, we'll be following Corey. And they are not subtle about his role in this movie at all.
Oh no, I got the death card. No, that's not bad on tarot. No, that just means a major phase is ending and a new one is about to begin, so...
But to build to that point, in an out-of-tune crescendo, this film decides to take Corey in a direction that they never could with Michael. And that is depth, right? Yeah, because if you don't know why Corey is evil, then how can you care, right?
Who's that person you're texting?
It's no
Boys who keep secrets don't get custard for dessert.
She says this to her 24-year-old son, by the way. And the film lays it on real thick how oppressed he is, and so that's why Corey is evil. How do you miss the point so wildly? But the other thing this movie does is touch upon Laurie's role in Michael's return now some years prior.
You tempted and you provoked that man when you should have left him alone.
This opens the movie up to a really interesting conversation that, well, of course, is entirely sidestepped for mostly the remainder of the narrative. What little elements of this discussion remain manifest in Laurie's relationship with Corey. She, and apparently everyone else in Haddonfield aside from Allison, can see a darkness behind Corey's eyes. So, admittedly, she does try to de-escalate it. But, unfortunately, the characters in this film are, without a doubt, the stupidest they have ever been. And by horror movie standards, that's impressive. It is one of the most reactionary movies I have ever seen. Everyone interprets every conversation as an attack, and it leads to the soapiest contrivances I've seen to date. It's that bad. This film doubles down on the idea that Michael grows stronger with each kill, and in this case, because of maybe his old age, it's a bit of a life support machine. You know what? I actually kind of like that. It's absolutely the wrong character and franchise to belong to, but if it were explored anywhere else, I think it would have been pretty cool. Oh wait, it has. No less in a film that not only came out before the original, but again, has wild amounts of rich social commentary. Oh, there it is again! We'll get back to this later. So now Michael looks like he's orgasming whenever he makes a kill. Thanks. Through Corey and Allison, the theme of burning down the past is, well, I'm going to use air quotes when I say explored. It's spoken about in every second fucking scene, but if all you're doing is reiterating, the messaging again appears exactly as it is. Very, very shallow. None of these threads are followed up on, and though if I squint really hard I might be able to see why Allison leaves Haddonfield, everything else just leaves a sour taste in the mouth. In the behind the scenes of 2018, old mate David says this.
To me, it's really about these 3 generations of women who are deeply affected by this incident that happened in 1978.
You've brought her back to the center of the story.
Right.
And her family.
Right, of course.
So you've established something, I call them Hello Women.
And you know what? That first film does it fantastically. But it's a little hard to carry that as the through line for your trilogy when one of those women literally isn't there. This film makes a concerted effort to forget Karen. Yeah, do you remember that she was horrifically murdered at the end of the previous film? No less by the man that left Laurie a traumatized, paranoid shut-in for 40-odd years? I wonder how Laurie feels about that, given that her fear of Michael returning to harm her family had forced the state to take Karen out of her custody because she was technically abusing her in preparation for the worst-case scenario. I wonder how Laurie's worst fears coming to fruition affect her in any way, because the movie just acts like it never happened. We're just gonna go bake pies! In fact, how the fuck does Haddonfield feel about any of this? Why are people still living there? Why do they behave as though Michael's gone? He's literally still in the town! People go missing every other week and they all attribute it to him. Is there a law reason to be this stupid? I'm sorry, Jamie Lee, but off the top of my head, I can name at least 2 other projects you've been involved in that thematically tackle trauma and crippling family dynamics far better. Hell, you play Laurie Strode better in The Bear!
Are you motherfuckers okay?
Don't even get me started on Laurie. She does virtually nothing but either antagonize or actively regress throughout the entire movie, to the point where it is insulting to the obstacles she learned to overcome in 2018, where, if you recall, she had been bound to a life of solitude by her intense PTSD. And then the movie has the goal to do the worst thing that I can think of.
Yes, I would like to report a suicide.
This is bad, but what happens next is worse.
Did you really think I'd kill myself?
Yes! Everything that this movie has illustrated to me so far, absolutely without a shadow of a doubt, tells me that, yes, you would absolutely do this to the character. Perhaps the movie deserves some credit there. Artificial stakes for the first time have never felt more threatening. This is such a loaded line that it does nothing but fucking infuriate me. I have been surrounded by people who self-harm and worse my whole life. And for a line to frame it as though it's a weakness is the most offensive thing I could possibly imagine. That is not an easy way out, and in saying this, you stand to mock the memory of everyone who has ever struggled with it before. How dare you take the earnestness of Laurie's response to PTSD and use it to justify suicide? Or perhaps worse, frame it as a manipulation tactic or threat to its audience. Hey Halloween fans, remember the legacy character that served as the emotional coil for not killing herself in spite of everything? Well now, she kills herself. Ain't that a treat? But don't just hear it from me. I'm gonna paraphrase some thoughts from my partner Killian, an AFAB horror fan who has struggled with self-harm all their life. Halloween 2018 is important in its depiction of the final girl post-1978. We're 40 years later, and what we meet with is far from the most well-adjusted survivor. The fortress she's locked herself in is a deliberate choice to show the audience how living with CPTSD is intensely isolating. Her family actively distance herself from her because she's just too much, and it's a crucial plot point that she lost custody of Karen, her own child, because her instinct to prepare her to defend herself against a potential home invader was borderline abusive. The only people who want anything to do with her at all are journalists who are looking to cash in on her story. Her trauma is an active disability, as it so should be tastefully depicted, warts and all. I find it gross that this film would choose to walk all of that back for shock value. Disagree if you must, but I find it in exceptionally poor taste and a stain on Laurie Strode's character entirely. If nothing else, I want this line to be the reason why this film isn't forgotten. I want it to stand as the movie that told its main character that it was okay to equate self-harm to weakness. It needs to remain in infamy where it belongs. And that's the only outburst I won't apologise for. If any of you are watching this feels that way, please, there are support services out there. I think that the most interesting part of all of this is that the novelization takes this moment and entirely changes the context with a single line. Video on that next week. I think that the worst offense of this movie, aside from how it systematically butchers every character possible, is how unmotivated the plot is. By the end of each act, I couldn't tell you what the next objective was or what the driving force was, but I could tell you exactly where it was going. And that's because this movie is a glorified speedrun to justify a few good concepts and a couple phenomenal scenes. After how good the prologue is, this movie feels like it's just faffing about until, oh look, Corey and Michael are killing, and oh look, Corey is going to be the next Michael Myers. All things that you would anticipate the second you saw the direction this film was taking. But why? Because, you know, little piss pants baby boy milk drinker white boy of the month Corey, who isn't a good boy and doesn't get custard for dessert, deems it so. Sorry, it's the anger. I'm working on that. Look, maybe now is a good time to say that all of this is not reflective of how I feel about Corey's actor Rohan Campbell at all. In fact, I feel like he gives maybe the best performance in the entire movie, and it's certainly not his fault that any of it went the way it did. If the circumstances were different, I think Rohan could have been a terrifying new boogeyman. This guy turns up to conventions despite the hate. He does it for the people who do like him, and if that doesn't tell you enough about his attitude towards all this, then I don't know what does. Even the final battle feels like an afterthought, like a cheap, gimmicky, nostalgia-appealing marketing tactic. This feels like the MCUification of horror at its worst. The fact that there even is a final battle is emblematic of how lazy this film is and how seriously it misunderstands even the simplest things it had established only 2 movies prior. Laurie Strode is meant to be clever. In 2018, despite 40 years of training and preparation, she knew that she wouldn't survive a one-on-one with Michael. So what does she do? She sets a trap. And maybe that trap would have worked had the firefighters not turned up to extinguish the blaze and kills. Hell, that same movie reinforced the idea that you won't beat Michael down.
You can't defeat it with brute force.
So tell me why their climactic final battle for the ages is a cock opera of callbacks and glup shittos while they go fisticuffs in the kitchen. This movie isn't concerned with giving you an ending deserving of its characters. It just wants to jingle keys in front of your face. Yum yum, eat the slop pig. So yeah, I'm fully convinced that this final battle was nothing but an afterthought. Laurie and Allison, the 2 main characters that stood to pass the torch down from one generation of being terrorized by the boogeyman to the next, feel like an afterthought. In my first video, I spoke about a scene in 2018 when Allison finally encounters Michael Myers from what she believed until that point was just a spooky bedtime story. I said it was the moment in which our newest hero meets our oldest villain. Well, in Halloween Ends, Allison doesn't even see Michael until the final 5 minutes of the movie, where he dies. Some moment. Allison becomes glorified arm candy for Corey. She's the only one in 2018 who attempts to empathize with Laurie's PTSD, and come Halloween Ends is at odds with her every decision. The interesting thing about the novelization is that it has a very thorough expansion on everything here. For example, it details Allison and Laurie's reaction to Karen's death, which is weirdly absent. An abandoned communal garden sprung up in the stead of the Myers home demolition. Oh yeah, did you remember the importance of that house in the last movie? Because this movie tries to forget it. It expands a lot on Corey and his relationship with his overprotective mother, and it explores Haddonfield's belief that the elusive cult of Sam Hain was responsible for sending the boogeyman to terrorize their town every Halloween. It is a really dense read, however, it does double down on some of the more controversial aspects of the story. So I'm going to leave a link to everything that the book expands upon from the movie in the description. Read at your own caution. Or of course, just stick around to next week where I'm going to talk about it in its entirety. Alright, enough word fodder. I have no music literacy whatsoever, but I know how to talk about what the music in these films makes me feel. The electric guitar strums are appropriately haunting. It sounds like the call of a predator, an attack. And Corey's theme is bloody phenomenal. Its use in this movie does not give it the grandeur it deserves because, holy shit. If you told me that this was the theme we'd be hearing for the next generation of the Boogeyman, helmed by Corey Cunningham, I would be ecstatic. Tracks like Transformation and Evil Eyes are brilliant and just goes to show that John Carpenter still has the sauce. I'm pretty sure that Jeremy's scream as he fell to his death in the opening is what's layered behind the monotonous rhythm of Corey's descent into insanity. It sounds like a distorted subversion of both Michael's theme and The Shape Stalks, and entirely its own new flavour of hate. Absolutely phenomenal. The tracks Kill the Cop and Corey and Michael particularly are such a haunting blend of the two themes that allude to the spiritual passing of the torch from one generation of evil to the next, that it just makes me wish that these movies were so much better than they are. I am not joking when I say that listening to the Halloween Ends score as frequently as I have for the past year is what made me want to revisit this film and want more from it. The music is operating on a level that does not deserve the movie it belongs to. It goes so hard when you're not looking at the screen. I seriously cannot give the score high enough praise if I tried. Like, if absolutely nothing else, the music across this trilogy is perfect. And if you haven't heard any of it, please go and listen to them. Or better yet, click another link in the description to take you to my own Michael Myers themed playlist featuring my favorite tracks from the movies, plus a feature from the beloved Ice Nine Kills as recommended by Killian. I say all of this because the worst part about these movies is that they look exactly how I want them to look. Like, if the movie had to be bad, could it spare me the heartbreak of looking and sounding like a movie I'd love? They get the atmosphere perfect. It is a trilogy of imposters. Not you, 2018, you're still great. I also feel like David Gordon Green was left in the kitchen for too long. The sequels needed a Deborah Hill to his John Carpenter because for all the good he brought to 2018, the female leads became disengaging and uninteresting very quickly. They needed someone to bring that personable, every girl perspective that Laurie Strode embodies in the original. What if each film in the trilogy was done by a different director? I would have loved to have seen different flavors reinterpret Michael's iconography. While I feel Michael is misrepresented in Halloween Ends, he is not misunderstood. As Dan Portman identified in his essay on the soullessness of Halloween Ends, quote, Michael Myers in the first Halloween is a subliminal study in evil. His entire being begs a deeply human question. Why? End quote. The sequels not only maintain his identity as a force of nature, but put it at the forefront of the story, which, while done with assumably good intention, serves to undercut exactly why its apparent lack of text works so well in the original. This flirts with the idea. This harasses you with the idea. Sure, maybe Michael does grow stronger from each kill, but that's not for us to know. It should be something that remains in the realm of theory, just like Michael inexplicably tanking 6 bullets and multiple stab wounds before getting right back up and doing it all over again. See, it's clear to me that David is a fan of the idea of Michael Myers, but perhaps he doesn't quite grasp why it is that that idea works. Looking back on 2018 and Kills, the movies depict what seems to be the late-stage romanticism of decades of reinterpreting the character. And when you take off the blood-tinted glasses, you realize that Michael's betrayal, and particularly Kills and Ends, is a very flanderized, shallow reflection of the character, because it's taking him at face value rather than respecting the source of his appeal. While there is a fantastic evolution of the character, there was just as many aspects to him that needed to remain timeless. If you'll allow me to reiterate, I spent the entirety of those 60 aforementioned minutes distilling my thoughts into a single phrase. Michael Myers is a character who I don't want to understand. He's a character I want to dread. It's the original's simplicity that makes it so palatable. The first Halloween's depiction of Michael lives and dies on mysterious allure alone. And Halloween Ends interprets everything concerning him as just text. If the movie raises a question about Michael, it will be answered in as much detail as possible.
Oof. Oh, g'day mate. Look, I'm working over at the Myers Home Demo site, and look, we're in the market for a new Michael Myers. Have you got any? You're in the right place, bro. How do you feel about walking home with an original make and model? We call him Old Reliable. Oh, he's a beaut. Just what we're looking for. Oh, I'm glad to see that you're familiar with him. Look, mate, I'm not going to give you the hard sell. He pretty much speaks for himself. Ironically, he doesn't. Unless, of course, you want to check out our new model. New model? Alright. Yeah, give us a spin. He has a tendency to overstay his welcome, but, let me walk you through his min-max strat. His what? Yeah, not only does Michael grow in power from each kill, it also makes him come. You want a spreadsheet of the stats? Alright, let's go. Killing children gives him a plus 12% elemental buff, while killing elderly folk increases his movement speed and critical hit chance by 6%. Staring blankly at his own reflection before hitting the gritty empowers his resolve, making him more resistant to women wielding cleaning apparatus. Now look, you want to keep your dogs locked inside because he's kind of developed an appetite for them. That also increases his power. He told me that he prefers dachshunds to greyhounds as they're less chewy. Yeah, nah, I want none of that. Your carpentry's all wrong.
Okay, inherently, the problem with these films is that they miss the appeal entirely. And you know what happens when you see the full picture? You realise that it's a pretty shallow picture. Let's talk about Corey. Unpopular opinion? I like the guy. Well, I like what he could have been. In fact, I think Corey coming in Act 3 of the trilogy and captivating me so much is a testament to how good David Gordon Green is at creating characters. Dead Meat also said it, but if nothing else, David Gordon Green is a powerhouse with his OCs. So, what went wrong? I feel like the movie was trying to do way too much too quickly. So much so that Halloween Ends very quickly left the main cast of the previous films behind, and it all became the Corey show.
Boys who keep secrets don't get custard for dessert.
Simon P. from the Rotten Tomatoes audience score writes, quote, "Here is the key factor to understanding this movie. If you're going into it with the intent of watching a slasher film, you won't find it. If you go in wanting a good story to end a series, you won't find it. What you will find is an amazing piece of psychological warfare. It would make for a great lecture on psychology. I wouldn't recommend it for a slasher." End quote. Thank you for your insight, Simon. Now, while I wouldn't call it an amazing piece of psychological warfare, I feel like we've just broken ground and can maybe diagnose perhaps the greatest plague on this film. Its identity problem. Corey's entire journey in this movie is boiled down to he's becoming Michael Myers 2.0, when I think he should become his own killer entirely.
What are you trying to kill yourself?
I'm not interested in immortality.
See, shit like this implies that Michael's Myerisms are a supernatural attribute rather than just a quirky girly pop mannerism that makes him distinct in a sea of horror icons. This is unsettling and no one else is doing this shit. Until Jason rolls around. Again, we've seen this before, and though it tells us what's happening to Corey, it's ham-fisted and feels like a cheap parody of the thing we recognize it for. Doing something different and bold is something that I will always encourage. However, I think what killed his chances of doing that effectively was making essentially a 180 pivot right at Act 3 in the trilogy. Somewhere in here is a good film with fantastic ideas and a thrilling conversation. But Frankensteining it with the Halloween series at so late a point does nothing but disappoint fans and offer newcomers a very shallow understanding of those new ideas as the film tears itself apart trying to be both. Now it's a discussion of whether all the ideas in this movie are inherently good but belong elsewhere. See, you couldn't really do the idea that Ends proposes with the copycat killer passing of the torch without one of the slasher genre's oldest villains. It's a catch-22 of a concept. You can't do it with Michael, but you can't really do it without him either. It's his notoriety in pop culture iconography that for decades he's been the face of evil, so on paper of course it has to be him. But in execution, the very nature of Michael's character, as established in 1978, purely lives and dies on Carpenter and Hill's stylistic experimentation alone. So, if you do a story like this, you run the risk of oversaturating the audience with him and lessening his dramatic appeal. And be as it may, I don't think he actually loses any of his dramatic appeal at all in Ends. I just think it's transformed into a more supporting role. He still has so much aura, but it's an entirely different aura to what was intended from his original purpose. He's less Michael Myers the Masked Killer and more Michael Myers the Masked Killer. He's not the man you saw brought into custody on the evening news. He's the elusive boogeyman the town fearfully whispers about, made real. I hear exactly how pedantic this all sounds, but there is a fine line to draw for this catch-22 that Halloween Ends proposes. He's not the same horror icon from years ago, and I think that evolution I've been droning on about really works to this film's advantage. In here is an idea that I really, really want to work, and the film gets so close to proving itself right, but it takes too many missteps to follow it through deservedly. The irony there being that, and this may shock you, Michael has the same amount of screen time in Halloween Ends than he does in the original film. But in the original, you always felt his presence. You know that if he isn't directly in a shot, he's probably just out of frame bumming a ciggy. 2018 narrowly pushed Michael to his breaking point from a character analysis because it ran the risk of saying too much. Hence what I said about Dr. Sartain and the Mask earlier. That's why Halloween 2 doesn't work as well for me. Once you tell me that he's possessed by a murder ritual that can only be satiated by killing his family, by the way, Laurie is now Michael's sister, it just breaks it all for me. So what's the solution? You can't really do a passing of the torch with slasher villains. There's a case to be made with Ghostface, but that's not really a deliberate handing of the mantle down. That's more of a crazed fan or vengeful relative assuming the title. But you see, Rocky can pass the torch to Adonis Creed. Bruce Wayne can pass the torch onto Blake or Terry McGinnis. Luke Skywalker can pass the actually, that's territory I've learned from. Not even gonna try dissecting that one. But while the protagonist's story is fundamentally about them, the same thing can rarely happen when villains pass their empire or mantle onto a younger protege. Both the protagonist and antagonist may be dealing with filling the shoes of the person that came before. That's interesting. The important thing here is that when characters have the esteem, that can be transformed and imbued into another character. And if you've noticed a pattern here, it generally always happens with franchise films. People get tired of seeing the same faces all the time, and if a franchise doesn't change or evolve, it'll grow tiresome and maybe fade into obscurity. So let's stick with the passing of the torch motif. After all, 2018 had already begun doing it with Allison, so maybe that's the through line for the trilogy. Change. Though in theory, a story about a man who becomes the monster people tells him sounds captivating, I feel that it falls a bit flat in Halloween Ends. And because my rewrite shrinks the window of the trilogy into a single night, having that arc would definitely feel rushed. Now, I'm not selling you snake oil here. I'm not talented enough of a writer to do all of that in what I imagine would be 8 to 10 hours in universe. I mean, how long can a single night last? Instead, I would start Corey a little further down the track. Think of how organic Henry Bauer's corruption arc felt from It Chapter 1. That was just 135 minutes where he had maybe all of 3 to 4 scenes. That's not a lot of runtime. But it was his behavior, the performance, the context, it all informed the subtext that told us that this was an unfortunately very believable place for him to go. That's kind of exactly the magic I want to strike here with Corey. Halloween Ends positioned Corey to be this vessel for social commentary. What's the commentary? Guilty until proven innocent? Haddonfield villainizes him for the accidental murder of a child he was babysitting, a case that he was quite literally proven innocent for, but naturally the anger lingers and he's cast out of the community. So his arc in this film is essentially becoming the very thing everyone expects of him. The whole "is this what you ask for" character progression, and oh my god, the Chucky TV show does successfully what Halloween Ends wants and fails to do. As you might have guessed, I take issues with this. Halloween 1978 works so well because it's not really trying to say anything at all, it's just a cool concept executed well. The social commentary is then found between the lines, and whether or not Carpenter made that a deliberate call, it's what keeps Halloween's messaging so clear. It's for that reason I really like the idea that Michael Myers targets Laurie for no particular reason at all. It's an affirmation of how violent men can be towards women just for the sport of it. As Roger Ebert would say in a review, quote, "As you watch Halloween, your basic sympathies are always enlisted on the side of the woman, not with the killer. The movie develops its women characters as independent, intelligent, spunky, and interesting people." End quote. I'm really glad that 2018 did away with Halloween 2's plot concerning Laurie Myers. It cheapens the terror that if a man wanted to harm a woman, he could invade her home and kill her. Mike Flanagan's 2016 film Hush actually explores that and deconstructs the male's testosterone-fueled retaliation to violence as opposed to the reality of a female's inherent vulnerability during a home invasion. In fact, I remember watching that film for the first time, frustrated that the protagonist wasn't fighting back, until a scene examined my perspective and showed me exactly why that wasn't an option. Again from Ebert, Halloween does not hate women. In short, Corey's function in the story needs to be able to communicate a lot without directly saying anything at all.
Which is why I think the characterization of Corey needs to serve as the antithesis to Michael. It needs to feel pathetic, it needs to feel deliberate. Unlike Michael, he needs to feel like he has an objective behind his killings. He needs a reason to attack the Strodes.
Let me remind you, according to the canon of the new movies, after that night in 1978, Michael never deliberately targeted Laurie again. He probably forgot all about her, and that's the irony of her never being able to move on. The axe forgets, but the tree remembers. Corey can't get away with that. No, he needs to take it all personally. The film could have appropriately subverted our expectations. Oh, wait, is that something we can't say anymore in film criticism? I don't care. The film could have appropriately subverted our expectations by having Corey instead be this vessel for a false passing of the torch. See, I have very mixed feelings about Corey in this film. On one hand, he really shouldn't be there. He distracts from the core narrative to do virtually nothing but shit on the legend of Michael, but on the contrary, maybe he is exactly the new flavor that the sequels needed to stand out. Had it begun a little earlier. Imagine this. In 2018, Michael returns to Haddonfield for his new massacre, and once again, the cozy town is upended in hysteric mania. Now, this is where I think both kills and ends deserve some credit. The littlest amount, mind you, I'm still furious. We see how the town responds to all this violence. We've got mistrusting shut-ins, a strict curfew, police surveillance, and hordes of fear-mongering rioters chanting, "Evil dies tonight," 30 times over.
But amidst all of this, a young man by the name of Corey Cunningham is angry at the world, and seeing the chaos finally feels like he belongs. He sees the mass panic Michael brings to the sleepy town and feels inspired. And with this opportunity, Corey acts. Lo and behold, Haddonfield hosts a copycat killer.
I don't think Corey's anger should come from inequity. I think it should come from something far more petty, pathetic, something generally overlooked in many antagonists. Entitlement. The unchecked privilege of the white man with so much anger, but nothing to truly be angry about. So he lashes out at people who have a purpose. He's disobedient, and above all else, he just desperately needs your attention. Becoming a copycat killer gives him purpose, an outlet for his anger, and the exact infamy that he seeks.
So that brings us to 2018. Corey goes to school with Allison. He's the school bully. He mocks her for her grandmother's history with Haddonfield and even goes so far as to dress as Michael during Halloween. Same as everyone's favorite crash test dummy from Halloween 2, Ben Tramer.
That poor man. Far out. He wears the outfit to spook Allison while she's in class, where Oscar is set off into a flurry of unrelenting punches, beating him down. The fight is intercepted and Corey is brought into the principal's office where his father, Deputy Cunningham, scolds him. He fishes through Lost and Found and finds a scarecrow mask for Corey. He says he's welcome to go trick-or-treating with his friends after school, but can't go to the party. But of course, Corey has no friends, so he sneaks out anyway. At the party, the same events occur. Cameron kisses another girl and Allison leaves with Oscar. They fumble their way through a shortcut and right into someone's front yard where Oscar hits on Allison and she leaves disgusted. This time, Corey turns up, drunk, angry, and having stalked them there to get his revenge on Oscar. He roughs him up and threatens him. And then, as you know it, the boogeyman stalks from afar.
Happy Halloween, Mr. Elrod.
The tension sets in as the man watching them disappears between light flashes before...
You're him.
From this point forward until the next movie, Corey is out of action. When paramedics arrive on the scene, they detect a faint pulse and rush him to the ER. And with that, I think we can leave 2018 well enough alone. It ends with those final few shots of the house burning, reminiscent of the original's ending, with Michael seemingly gone. Next is Halloween Kills, and it opens with what might be a big point of controversy in my rewrite: the flashbacks. The 1978 flashback recreation in Kills is phenomenal, and it's clear so much love was put into it, making it as accurate as possible. Unfortunately, that's emblematic of the worst that this film has to offer. It is, as Taylor had said, a glorified highlight reel. It signals to me the worst thing about the movie, and that is that it puts style first and substance second.
We have Miss Marion Chambers. She survived an assault.
You could get away with it back in 1978, but now this is the middle part of a trilogy of sequels. You don't really have the room to slam the brakes for a nostalgic sightsee. And for the fans, yeah, it feels euphoric having that patience and devotion rewarded. And yes, some flashbacks serve a fantastic thematic purpose, so all will not be scrapped. I just think the movie is oversaturated with them. It is for this reason that I believe Halloween Kills can be split into two parts: the 2018 Evolution and the 1978 Shackles. And yes, there is a mild overlap.
The problem here is that when looking at these films as a trilogy, they sort of wrote themselves into a hole by doing that. All they have to show you is just the same story you've already seen, and any innovation on that feels shallow. So the parts where they try something new, like Michael emerging from a burning building to slaughter the firefighters, or him returning to his home to kill the Johns, feels like a fresh taste of the formula we love. But if you'll notice, it's almost always the Michael plot that feels the most fresh. Not entirely new, mind you, but different enough. Hence the aforementioned blunt object Michael. He's the piece that shakes up the formula. And there's something to be said about the ensemble cast not being able to innovate, instead being shackled to their trauma with their heads buried in 1978. But when that's the only thing to them, it makes for a really boring, monotonous movie. So on one hand, because of that hole, I don't blame Enns for taking such a drastic turn for the worse. But on the other hand, I'm stuck here trying to fix it.
Though so much remains the same, there needs to be a change. Michael's characterization across this film transforms him into the boogeyman. It's why gratuitously violent scenes work so well to accent the quieter, unsettling scenes. One of the things that I adore from 2018 is the long take at the 45-minute mark, taking you right into Michael's perspective. I think that creative choice is another one of those things that allows the sequels to evolve and expand upon its existing material. So, let's make it a staple. However, this time around, instead of taking Michael's perspective, let's innovate. The best parts of the original film, and even Halloween 2, are how the chase scenes feel so isolating and claustrophobic. And that's done so well because you know that no matter how fast you run, Michael will always catch up to you. So, what does that look like to an unsuspecting child? In the film, a trio of trick-or-treating children prank the Johns, now residing in the refurbished Myers house. Hey, it looks like Strode Realty finally paid off. The Johns frighten the children with the story of the boogeyman who used to live there.
Let's say that after those children leave to diverge in further candy-oriented pursuits, Michael watches from afar. What begins with him appearing seemingly out of nowhere to watch the children slowly evolves into a motivated march closer when one of the children separates from the others to scope out more potential victims. The score would be reminiscent of Halloween 2's The Shape Stalks Again, and the parallels wouldn't end there. As Michael steadily draws nearer and nearer across the one take, the camera pulls tighter and tighter, even framing the two of them in the very same iconic split diopter shot. We're sat there screaming at the unsuspecting child to turn around, but it falls on deaf ears until finally they meet their fate at the hands of the boogeyman, a chilling campfire tale made real.
I think the use of a one-take like this could illustrate the movie's themes about Michael's legend better than anything else. While Michael takes it to the streets, Corey awakens in the sheets of the hospital, and this is where I imagine he would remain as the film's C-plot. His story would function exactly like Harry Osborn in Spider-Man 2. He sees Haddonfield tearing itself apart in hysteria and feels inspired. He sees it as an opportunity to lash out and takes it. His story is put on the back burner as to give it the thematic breathing space for an appropriate and proportionate downward crescendo into becoming Michael's eventual protege. I would want his reasoning to attack people to feel organic and not forced. He has a justified anger, selfish, entitled, yet believable. I definitely want to keep that ending with Michael killing tons of people on the street, as thematically it's falling action into a beautiful cliffhanger ending. Karen survives, and Laurie leaves the hospital, vowing to hunt Michael. The final scene would see an escaped Corey Cunningham wearing a hospital gown with the scarecrow mask, bearing blood tears. He heads to his home and kills his parents out of anger, his first steps as a killer. It would be a fantastic callback to H2 and a terrifying costume for him to begin his career as a killer, as an epilogue to the story, setting up what's to come in the grand finale. And now, we're finally at Halloween Ends. It is still Halloween night 2018. A strict curfew has been enforced. Little Jeremy sits inside with his babysitter.
We're coming home right away. Stay indoors.
Is everything okay, Mom?
Can you please put Lewis on the phone for me, baby?
Miss Allen?
Lewis, I need you to lock all the doors and windows. Something's going on.
Up to your room right now. I need you to go upstairs.
Corey grabs him by the throat to muffle his cries and drags him toward the edge of the stairwell, kicking and screaming. Jeremy attempts to break free, but Corey has inhuman strength disproportionate to his build. Something evil lurks within.
What's that?
Jeremy!
Oh God, no, please!
Across the movie, Michael isn't perturbed by Corey shadowing his killings. There's an unspoken camaraderie between them, a sickening dynamic duo, or a symbolic passing of the torch from one generation to the next. Laurie and what remains of Haddonfield mobilize to hunt Michael, unaware of the new killer.
The midpoint of the film is where we get our third and final take for the trilogy. This time, we're in the perspective of Corey. The two of them invade multiple homes and slaughter 5 people. Noticeably, Corey's aggression juxtaposes how emotionally removed Michael is from his killings. Where Corey seeks to hurt the people who did him wrong, his frustration with Michael's indiscriminate, unmotivated violence begins to boil. But he swallows his dissatisfaction and continues to lurk in Michael's shadow. Meanwhile, the Haddonfield resistance realize that their mob violence seen in the previous film is not the way to kill Michael. They can't comprehend what he's become. Laurie takes it back to formula and devises a trap, propelling the story into Act 3.
Happy Halloween, Michael.
But the trap fails, and Corey gains the upper hand on Laurie, bringing Michael back into their 44-year-old conflict for the final time. Where Corey takes a motivated bitterness towards Laurie, Michael is devoid of any resentment. Personal attachment is foreign to him. He is, as he has always been, inhuman, yet again, entirely unchanged by her presence. Corey feels threatened by Michael's emotional disconnect, How could Corey aspire to be like the man who had shown him how to take a life and enabled his violence as an emotional outlet? But of course, Michael is no man. He is purely and simply just evil. Corey snaps, attacking Michael, but Michael overpowers him and kills him. Like a robot with a new directive, Michael engages Laurie, and after a final struggle, Laurie, Allison, and Karen kill him. We finish on a final shot of Haddonfield as it fades to black. Halloween Ends can bring the finality that the closing shot of each film never brought. For good reason. The shape is no more. At its bare bones, this is essentially what the film is aiming to do, but the film misses the mark on several counts. I think it's important for Corey's perceived entitlement over Michael here to be on full display. No one takes the role of the killer away from Michael, and it's important the audience feels threatened by Corey's efforts to seize that control. It engages us and brings us closer to the film's narrative conflict. Hey, Michael may be a ruthless geriatric killing machine, but goddammit, he's our ruthless geriatric killing machine. And who does this Corey kid think he is for coming in and stepping on his shoes? Where Corey interprets Michael's killings as some kind of hate-filled crusade, the reality is that Michael is just kind of doing it. He doesn't really have a need or a why behind his killing. It's just what he does. And I think that distinction between the two characters not only needs to be made clear, but serves as the entire basis for Corey as a whole. That is his function in the story, and that is how you make him work. Corey seeks purpose behind his violence so that he can rival Michael's notoriety because he assumes that's why Michael does it all. And him being completely wrong about it all is exactly what is needed. There's no greater mission here. There's no Sam Hain or Colt of Thorn to tell you to unalive your sister. This would serve Corey to unwittingly undermine himself about Michael, making him more petty, and actually highlights why Michael is very successfully the blueprint. Michael undermines every action Corey takes and every word he speaks in his self-appointed violent temper tantrum of a crusade. And finally, in his final moments, as Michael strangles the life out of him, he understands that. And the last thing that Corey would ever feel was absolute terror. Within Corey's corruption arc across the trilogy, it makes clear to the letter why Michael is important to the story. You know, beside being the poster child for the franchise. Among the many, many problems this film faces, it has yet another identity crisis. It's as though it's trying its hardest to speedrun cramming in as many bad choices into a single film as possible. There is sufficient evidence to support the theory that Halloween Ends is a spiritual successor to an idea established in Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. What was that idea? That the Halloween movies could be an anthological collection of stories centered around Halloween night. And this isn't without grounds, because when you look back and examine the sequel trilogy, it's pretty fair to say that, all in all, 2018 Kills and Ends were more or less pseudo-remakes of Halloween, Halloween 2, and Halloween 3. For those unfamiliar, Season of the Witch is a story about a best-selling toy company that distributes masks that will kill children all around the country. And you'll notice a distinct lack of a certain someone. Now, again, to its credit, this idea in Halloween Ends isn't dumbfounded. In fact, there is so much in support of this that it is a little overwhelming. To a degree that makes me wonder perhaps if David Gordon Green even wanted to finish off the trilogy before moving on to something else. Or at the very least, exploring more versatile areas of the horror realm. Let me elaborate. First and foremost, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill never wanted to make a sequel to Halloween. But if a sequel had to exist, the idea was that it could be an expansive collection of other horror stories. Like the Goosebumps books, as opposed to a connecting story spanning multiple sequels. One movie you could get Michael Myers returning to the suburbs to invade your home, and that might be the first and last time you see him, because the very next movie could be about Gary, the crazed curbside sign spinner who got a taste for blood. After all, if it weren't for the many, many Halloween sequels, the 80s could have seen a plethora more iconic horror villains from the franchise. Hey, maybe Gary the crazed curbside sign spinner could have been a household name just like old darling Michael. Will Pinfold writes in his article, quote, Looked at critically, Halloween doesn't really appear to have much mileage as an idea to fuel a franchise, and the long list of mediocre movies that have followed it tend to reinforce that statement, end quote. Now here's the funny thing. Season of the Witch was supposed to be the first of that anthological collection of Halloween-centered stories. Again, you'll note that this is the only Halloween movie in the entire franchise that does not feature our favorite asthmatic. And it was critically panned. Thus, Halloween 4 would release some years later and return to form with a new subtitle, The Return of Michael Myers. The rest is history. The irony is that since its release, Season of the Witch has become a bit of a cult classic purely for its boldness to do something new.
Turn it off! Turn it off! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
In fact, I think that the reason Halloween 3 has aged so well is because it dares to do something so unique that I think that they shot themselves in the foot when they made Michael as cool as he is. Now, while the two films rarely share exact details, aside from the font for its opening title and movement of the story, looking at the two of them, you can see the influence. The problem being that this film feels like it wants to branch out and try something else, but remembers it's shackled to the story of Michael, and herein lies my frustration. If ever there was a time to reattempt the roots of Carpenter's vision without Michael, it was right after 2018, when Michael was presumed dead after the burning in the house. As I've stated with my previous video, the final few shots of the 2018 sequel do exactly what the original 1978 film did for Michael Myers, and that is eliminate finality. And you know what? You could still keep that and move on to do different things for the Halloween franchise. You could end it right there with that alluring atmosphere and leave the audience with the question of Michael's survival. A one-and-done Halloween sequel set 40 years later that turned up and reinvented itself for the modern day to remind us why Michael changed the landscape of horror in an epic sequel. A grand, well-earned mic drop. You could have ended it all right after that. But you know where it's wildly inappropriate to make a deadly 180 pivot for your 44-year-old series? In the fucking finale! You want my opinion? Halloween needed to abandon Michael Myers long ago, and I've never been more serious. To hell with Laurie. To hell with Corey. If anything was made clear to me from this movie, it's that being a fan of this series is a punishment sent to us by the gods. I have never felt more ashamed and hurt to be a fan of Halloween. Despite its best efforts, Halloween Ends isn't the spiritual successor to Carpenter's wish for an anthology. No, it's not even close. It's an unimaginative failure that barely succeeds in passing the torch, and actively rescinds any progress made by the first 2018 sequel. If Halloween Ends were truly an anthology, it should be able to confidently stand on its own, separated from Michael and Laurie's conflict. And in fact, after all this, I really wish that it were. A 2021 interview with Polygon revealed that right from the start, David wanted to do two movies. Jason Blum, head of the Blumhouse production company, said, quote, "We're not going to decide if we do a sequel or not until we see the reaction to 2018, end quote. It was after the smashing success of that film that our beloved director was granted not just one, but two additional sequels, making it a contemporary trilogy. Since then, he has equated the production of the two remaining sequels to, quote, a sick adventure that feels like a daydream, end quote. In that very same article, he would discuss how stressful the experience was. In a discussion with Entertainment Weekly, he would reveal that Halloween Ends was being written simultaneously to Halloween Kills, with a different writing team. While Kills would be his ode to contemporary action slasher popcorn shocker horror culture, Ends would, quote, return to the simple dramatic roots, end quote. It would be the story that he ultimately always wanted to tell. And interestingly enough, the evidence is all there. As I've discussed throughout the video, Kills and Ends fundamentally are two very different beasts. The former mostly conforms to becoming just another familiar and comfortable slasher experience. Well, as comfortable as those usually go. And the parts that they would take away from that, the uncomfortable, ham-fisted social commentary that would occupy the second half of the film entirely, would become the entirety of Halloween Ends, where this time around it abandons that familiar formula to become, as our director would describe, quote, an artistically confident genre film, End quote. So much so, in fact, that it feels like a movie inspired by an era that it inherently doesn't exist in, yet belongs to very appropriately. David Gordon Green has said in multiple interviews that the biggest inspiration behind Halloween Ends are a combination of 80s horror and coming-of-age flicks. My Bodyguard, Butcher, Baker, Nightmare Maker, Bad Taste, Natural Born Killers, and namely, John Carpenter's adaptation of the Stephen King novel, Christine. And when comparing the movies side by side, you can kind of see them everywhere. And then everything becomes so much clearer. You can see exactly where Halloween Ends exits the realm of its franchise to try and say something new. In an interview with MovieMaker.com, David would say, quote, "Honestly, we never considered making a Laurie and Michael movie. The concept that it should be a final showdown type brawl never even crossed our minds. We were always more ambitious than that." End quote. Wow. That explains so much. That's a bit of a problem when they are the main characters of the film franchise you're adapting, especially so in the finale that would bring those characters to their conclusion. I feel like this has become a bit of a trend with recent horror properties, to the extent that Scream 5 talks about legacy characters in the same vein as seat-filling nostalgic tropes. What this tells me is that his plea to return to Halloween's simple dramatic roots are a little off target. He would say to Slash Film, quote, "I knew I wanted to put my heart on my sleeve and make a movie about bad boys and motorcycles and leather jackets," end quote, which is the epitome of the 80s youth deviant heartthrob movies, but the antithesis to John Carpenter's original, because the story at its core was always about the women. He had just made another 80s movie. And making a love letter to the Lost Boys and Heathers out of a Halloween sequel signals to me another epitome of the late-stage revisionism of the 80s that Stranger Things popularized. So while, yes, it is a return to a form, it's not a return to the form that made Halloween Halloween. And he knew that this would be a point of conflict for fans, because you'll note that Corey is conveniently missing from all of the marketing material. He's not on the back of the cover for the DVD anywhere, and it's corroborated by a warning to the actor from both David and Jamie Lee Curtis about the backlash he would face. When discussing why Corey was pivotal to his story, he would say, quote, "We made Halloween Ends about what can create a psychopath without having to go into a Michael Myers psychological backstory. People have tried to do it and it just isn't interesting to me because it tends to make him less scary as an entity." End quote. So how do you say this and then justify Michael's entire goal throughout kills to go home? That's inherently the problem with justifying Michael Myers' objective. He doesn't have one. He's just coming home and killing and that's it. I like the allure of him going to the window without a purpose. It's a flirt, and it gives us enough to think about, but continuing to bash us over the heads with it just destroys it. Hey, David Gordon Green, did you ever stop to think that maybe Michael Myers was just having a non-verbal episode and decided to make it everyone's problem? David encouraged Rowan Campbell to really dive into the extravagant sides of Corey. Variety describes a story where, quote, "The camera rolled for 16 minutes as Campbell was directed to mumble about how much his character loved chocolate milk." What the fuck? Rowan would then detail the confusion from the film's own crew about the movie that they were making. Quote, "It was romance scene after romance scene. I was upstairs shooting an indie movie with Andy while people were getting their tongues cut off downstairs." End quote. In an interview with Collider, David would justify the movie's wild time jump was done to equate for Laurie's stab wound in 2018, which had left her bedridden all throughout kills. It wasn't a thematic choice to set the film so far forward, it was an attempt to write themselves out of the ditch they had put themselves in when they were unaware they were making sequels. In another interview with Uprocks.com, he would suggest the canonicity of Season of the Witch, which only confuses the world building further when you realize that John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween exists in that universe as a blockbuster hit. Several times. In that same article with Entertainment Weekly, David says, quote, "I've come too far with Laurie Strode and I want to believe in her. I want to believe in her future." End quote. And you know what? I want to believe in those cherry blossoms too. What an intimate, lovely note to end the movie on. But that's not what the movie ends on, is it, David? If you ask me, this signals the point where David got a bit lost in the sauce. An inflated ego and passion to tell a story not fit for the finale distracted him completely. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Somewhere in here is a great movie, but not a great Halloween movie. And to a degree, I don't blame him. They gave it their all in 2018 under the preface that it would be their one shot. When 2 further sequels were given the green light, they really had to pull something out of their asses, and that's when he saw an opportunity to make his dream 80s horror flick out of Halloween Ends. Less than a week after the movie had released, a petition garnering over 16,000 signatures called for the complete reshoot of Halloween Ends. People were pissed. I felt their anger, and now I just have a bittersweet understanding of what could have been. The launch of such a hate-fueled petition is partly what inspired my own undertaking here. The idea that we are owed something from our favourite stories, that we feel that we should be compensated for our devotion and our enthusiasm. And it's hard to roll with the punches when what we love has been transformed into something we just don't recognise. I get that. And right now, all I have to offer is forgiveness. I've been angry for a long time, and maybe I'll continue to be. I guess the natural conclusion to me giving bad films the benefit of the doubt is that inevitably I would meet my match. But I know it's unhealthy to hold on to all that. Anger is indeed an addictive habit, so even if I disagree, I will learn to live with that disappointment and try to turn it into empathy. You don't have to. This is my journey. Now, did the sequels need to happen? No, not at all. They amounted to an overstuffed Vanity Fair of recycled iconography and very little imagination. And I know that sounds harsh, but look, there's enough in these that you can switch off for a few hours and have a fun time, but as soon as you start thinking about what you're watching, they fall apart.
I'm the psycho. You're the freak show.
In this case, I just can't ignore the bad. You gotta expand for sequels, but Kills and Ends really only left me with one question. Was the expansion worth it? I don't think so. If these Halloween sequels only meant a deeper expansion on Michael, then I really don't think we needed that. In fact, it's the oversaturation that ironically kills it for me. That's exactly why Rob Zombie's remakes don't do it for me. But, Michael was the best part of the original film. Yes, he was. And he had less than 10 minutes of screen time. Michael was made captivating because of how John Carpenter and Deborah Hill experimented with their filmmaking. Simply put, Michael is the antagonist, not the protagonist. It's not a story about him, and he isn't the main character. I think that distinction is what makes David Gordon Green's Halloween fun and new, but fundamentally flawed. Now, don't let the thin veil of the entire video leading up to this point fool you. I'm actually not looking for anything avant-garde from a fucking Halloween sequel. And my counterpoint is simply that the movie that had started it all nearing 50 years ago stands the test of time because it's a good movie. I'm not trying to throw you a curveball here. The reason why John Carpenter's Halloween was so successful is because it was a good movie. Wow. Please subscribe. It's because of this that I feel we deserved something more. But now, I'm not really sure we do. Audiences are less concerned with the creative freedom in 1978 and instead chasing the proverbial highs of, I guess, a blockbuster horror experience? Or is it the execs sitting in the big chair that don't trust us? Is that why they play it safe and follow a stale formula? But I'm part of the problem. I spent months rewriting an answer to a question that shouldn't have been asked. Truth be told, when I set out to do all of this, it was to find the meaning between the lines and bring it to the surface. My rewrite was supposed to enhance the existing material. But I think that this final review from Mark Z put it best. Halloween Ends is the complete antithesis of the original John Carpenter low-budget thriller. The attempt to create a supernatural thread tying this dumb story to the original is just disappointing. Once you've dined at a gourmet restaurant with 5-star service, why would you settle for a McDonald's meal for the same price? Like, yes, sure, it still gets the job done, but you're missing an integral part of the experience. There's something to be said about disposable media, or what I would prefer calling turn off your brain and enjoy it films. And that's entirely your prerogative to determine which films are those films. But firstly, fuck you, this is my therapy session. And secondly, if I've seen the value that I can get for a fraction of the cost, why shouldn't that be the norm? And maybe that's just on me. Maybe I naively placed my faith in some disposable horror. And saying it now, yeah, I definitely sound naive. But an hour-long deep dive into the craft behind John Carpenter's Halloween had taught me to think otherwise. A film so deliberately experimental had told me that we deserved something more. But I guess this will remain in infamy as perhaps the greatest misstep for the series. Until the next Halloween. That's my self-appointed Corey Cunningham crusade. Some call it a rewrite. I call it trying and failing to polish a big, stinky fucking turd.
You know what? That felt good. I needed that. You've been a really good listener. Thank you, Doc. Well, I guess I can close the book on that one. What the fuck?
Hey everyone, if you're a fan of this channel, then you know it's been a while since my last upload. As of this video coming out, I've hopefully graduated my final year of uni as a screenwriter. Watch this age poorly. This project was my biggest one yet, and it's all thanks to my supportive friends for tolerating me and helping me with the long days of shooting, and my patrons who, without you, I wouldn't have afforded most of this equipment. I made a pledge on my Patreon that any money earned was money put right back into production, and that's exactly where it all went. New microphones, monitors, hell, even a teleprompter for more essays. I started this project pretty much as soon as I saw Halloween Ends in 2022, and it didn't enter production until December 2023, but I made a promise to myself that, in spite of the irony of the subject matter, I would never hate making this video, no matter how challenging it got. If that meant putting it on the back burner to my studies or slowing down and revisiting it when I could give it my attention, then so be it. This is a video full of milestones and personal achievements, even if it is just me having a great big old sook for an hour. Or more. I actually don't know how long this is going to be. I want to again thank all of my friends for their creative input, learning with me how to use the new equipment and making the very most of our time together. Going forward, I've got ideas of videos that probably don't have a fantastic shelf life, but I want to make them anyway. I love you all. See you soon.
This is terrifying. Fucking asshole.